Well, hello everyone, and we are in America, and we have entered, or about to enter, the American Gilded Age. Very interesting period in American history, and of course American art history, in American arts in general, whether it's sculpture, architecture, art. And what's called the Gilded Age, sort of approximately, as you see here, lasted from about 1870 through 1900, and then really before the war, before the First World War. Even though the term itself was given later, and it was derived from Mark Twain's and Charles Dudley Warner's The Gilded Age, the novel called The Gilded Age, which satirized the era of serious social problems masked by a thin gold gilding. It was gold gilding, but it wasn't very thin, actually. It was slapped on very extensively. The age coincided with the portion of Victorian era in England, and the so-called Belle Epoque, the beautiful epoch in France. Here is sort of, if you want to use markers, here's one of the markers, and that is the completion of the first transcontinental railroad in 1869. And this was the time of enormous accumulation of capital. This was the time of robber barons. This was the time when all these great families, or the future great families, were competing for ownership of steel and railroads. It will come to its climax, really, in terms of a show, in 1893. And in 1893, there was held the World's Columbian Exposition. The first such international exposition was held in London in 1851, which was meant to bring together as many industrialized countries as possible and to show the world what had been achieved in terms of technology and the arts together. And then there were a number of other exhibitions. The 1889 in Paris that commemorated 100 years since the French Revolution, and that's when the Eiffel Tower was built for that particular exhibit. And now the commemoration was of a 400-year discovery of America by Columbus. The exhibit was timed to mark the 400th anniversary. It came a year later, not in 92 but in 93, because of the logistics, because putting something like this together would be quite tremendous. And as a result, it came a year later. Altogether it cost something like $30 million. Today it would probably be the equivalent of $1 billion. So, centerpiece of the fair was a large pool that represented a long voyage that Columbus took to the New World. And Chicago had won the right to host this exhibit over several other American cities, which included New York, Washington, St. Louis. And it will actually be a tremendously influential social and cultural event. And it will have a profound effect on American town planning, on sanitation, the arts, the American technological optimism, American optimism about the future. Also, of course, Chicago's tremendous self-confidence, because these Midwestern towns, Chicago, St. Louis, they were really were becoming very important marketing centers, and they wished to show themselves as such. All the buildings and the sculpture, 90% of it, probably 99% of it, were neoclassical, done as in neoclassical architecture. It covered about 700 acres, about 200 new buildings, as I said, of predominantly neoclassical architecture. There were canals, lagoons, and there would be people and cultures from about 50 countries, and about 30 million people attended. Well, more than 27 million, so that's, you can round it up to about 30 million. It ran for 6 months, and its scale far exceeded all the previous world exhibits of this type, and became a symbol of emerging American exceptionalism, sort of the same way as the original Great Exhibit showed the exceptionalism of Great Britain, and then the Paris exhibits, of course, of France. And this is where the very first Ferris wheel was installed, in fact. As you see around this great pool, there were a great deal of sculpture, a great deal of building, because even 30 million wasn't enough for this kind of scale. Most of the buildings were, and sculpture for that matter, were constructed in perishable material, and well, it perished soon enough. And but, however, because of the town planning of the exhibit, and because of all the innovations, and because of the reintroduction of the great elements of classical architecture, all of this became very important. San Francisco was inspired certainly by the exhibit. The mall in Washington, D.C., that great mall that is lined up with all the classical buildings, the museums, that also was in fact inspired directly by the Columbian exhibit. There's our original Ferris wheel. It was designed and constructed by George Ferris Jr., and that was the landmark for the exhibit. At the very first one, the landmark was the Crystal Palace that was made completely of iron and glass, and then of course the Paris exhibit was the Eiffel Tower, and here at the Chicago exhibit it became the Ferris wheel, in addition to just the general layout of the exhibit itself. And today, of course, it's just called the Ferris wheel everywhere around the world, but it's a generic term that's been coined in honor of its creator. And you can just imagine, here is the layout of the exhibit, and as you can see, there are plenty of canals here, and the bodies of water, and beautiful structures. And so when one got on that Ferris wheel, one could in fact see it from on high and have the beautiful view of this really tremendous, absolutely tremendous undertaking. And Chicago will never be the same again after this. It became a very important city. I mean, as I said, it was getting there already, but this pinpointed it so much more. So the Plaster Palace France, had little functional relationship to the exhibition itself, and as I said, soon enough it was all demolished because it just couldn't stay. It was called the White City because there was this feeling of white marble everywhere, and that's why it was called the White City. And so America was very much coming into one's own, and America was becoming very wealthy, and art follows the wealth. So there was the great question of how to commemorate American greatness, because there was no question of commemorating the deep American past, because Americans felt that compared to Europe, they didn't have deep American past, and at the time they were not interested in learning about the indigenous populations. They wished to compare themselves to Europe, which obviously at which point they were at a disadvantage, because the so-called European past America didn't really possess. But they wanted to create it nevertheless, and in order to do so, they went to Europe and they began to emulate European examples. And essentially that's what the Gilded Age was all about, trying to emulate as much as possible from the European examples and justifying themselves by Europe's own history when they would remember the times, remember the times about which they had read, that when Rome was not much of a city in terms of culture, but became very powerful and wealthy, and suddenly found itself master of the Mediterranean. They too felt that, well, we don't have much culture, but we inherited a great deal of it in one fell swoop between Egypt and Palestine and Greece, most importantly Greece, of course. So we can borrow, and that's exactly what they did. They went. Sometimes they paid and brought things back to Rome. Sometimes they plundered, but
to America or
no, Rome.
Okay.
No, America didn't plunder.
Oh yeah.
America paid.
I see. Okay.
No, America did not plunder.
I see. All right.
No. But Rome did. Rome, without question, did. And so Americans were perfectly justified in their completely legitimate acquisition of European treasures, and they were very excited about that whole history, whether cultural, whether political, geographical, and wished to have as much as possible. Meanwhile, they felt they might as well sort of graft it on the American history, or vice versa, that American history could be grafted on the European history. And thus the equestrian monuments, of which America has quite a number, and one of the greatest sculptors, or American sculptors, who was actually born Irish, his name was Augustus Saint-Gaudens. He was, in this particular monument, he was helped by Alexander Proctor and an architect, Stanford White. And this is the General Logan Memorial in Chicago, in Grant Park. And General Logan himself was a great hero of the American Civil War, of course, and prior to that, I think, the Mexican War. And here he is shown on this very noble, impatient stallion, and he himself, his face is a proud face and yet contained, and he is holding in his hand, he's holding the American flag with sort of a Roman eagle, and here. The face is determined, wind-blown, the mustache is dangerous, and a mustache is being blown as his hair, his look is serious and directed forward, and he is containing his stallion that is impatient to proceed, and he is containing him with just one arm holding the reins, while the other arm, of course, is brandishing the flag. The Saint-Gaudens himself, as I said, born in Dublin, and then he trained in Paris, he trained in Rome, as so many of American artists of this time will be. His career spanned, as you see, 3 decades, and he created nearly 150 works of art, including some of the most valuable and famous American coinage. He very much, of course, looked at the Italian Renaissance, and he saw such works as Michelangelo, Bernini, and he felt that the the whole piece of art has to be integrated, and that the painting, sculpture, architecture, all of this has to work together. In fact, in this particular sculpture, it's Alexander Proctor who did the horse, but under Gaudens' auspices, and then Stanford White, whom we will meet on several occasions during this lecture, he designed the whole setting here. This is, and actually there's a mausoleum inside, where Logan and his wife actually were supposed to be entombed, but they're buried in Washington, D.C. So there were plans to move them, but these plans never really never came to fruition. The best examples of American equestrian statues at this point were by Remington, which of course became very, very famous. Frederick Remington, who was not just a sculptor, he was also a painter, illustrator, and was very much in love in the American West, sort of the American West that we saw in the previous lecture, and concentrated on the scenes from the last quarter of the 19th century, and featuring particularly cowboys, U.S. cavalry, this sort of thing. This is probably one of his more famous pieces, the Bronco Buster, and it portrays this the frontier, the rugged frontier cowboy who's taming a wild horse and who is attempting to stay atop of the horse, the plunging bronco, stirrups swinging free, and then a fistful of mane and reins. He just grabs the reins and the mane in his left hand, while the other hand flies free. And still one of the most popular of American bronze sculptures. And it's also, well, this one is small. It only has two supports, which are two bronze legs, two legs of the horse, which of course in a larger horse, in a larger monument would present a problem. However, it wasn't really, I mean, Remington, everybody knew about Remington, of course, but it wasn't really to Remington that Gaudens went for inspiration. It was more to Renaissance sculpture and Renaissance equestrian monuments. And one such is in the city of Padua, which is not far from Venice, and in which exists this statue of Donatello of Gattamelata. The Gattamelata, his actual name was Erasmo da Narni. He was one of the condottieri, private military commanders in the Italian Renaissance, who became very wealthy, often in their own right, and then became landowners in their own right. So this one, Gattamelata, is portrayed here by Donatello. Now, Renaissance did not inherit any equestrian statues from ancient Rome, even though there were plenty of them in ancient Rome. But bronze, being extremely expensive and extremely valuable since the Roman times, most of it, all of it really, had been melted for weaponry, for coins, for what have you. So the only example, in fact, that existed in Renaissance Rome of an equestrian statue, there was this bronze statue of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. And the reason it survived was because the early Christians, who considered all Roman emperors pagan, and as such not worthy of preservation, they felt that this perhaps was Emperor Constantine, who was the first Christian emperor who legalized Christianity and who was the first to found Christian churches all over the Roman Empire. So he was proclaimed a saint, and fortunately this sculpture was preserved, this bronze sculpture. And it's to this that Donatello first and then Verrocchio went to look at how to create an equestrian sculpture. So you see here, this is our Donatello. This one is actually a copy in Victoria and Albert, but it's the best angle to see how it's done. This horse as well, this one has a support, has a cannonball as a support, and it makes it easier for such a large and heavy bronze sculpture to stand on 4 supports. The 3 is the next option, and of course 2 are very precarious. But this seems to have 3. In fact, originally it had 4, because originally it seems that under the horse there was a splayed body of a barbarian defeated by Marcus Aurelius, and thus the horse would stamp on the barbarian and acquire an extra support. But these are rather similar horses, the difference being that in the ancient example, as you see, Marcus Aurelius's legs are positioned much, much lower than Gattamelata's legs. Marcus Aurelius' legs are in fact under descent below the belly of the horse. And that's because there was a convention at the time, going back to 5th century BC in Athens, to create horses of a smaller scale than a rider. But so long as the horse is excellently done, one doesn't really see it. However, Renaissance reverted now to an appropriate scale of horse to rider, and thus you see that the horse itself is a much larger scale vis-a-vis the rider than the ancient one. And do I have another one? No, I don't have another one. Okay, there's another equestrian sculpture by Verrocchio, but in Venice. When Saint-Gaudens received his next commission, and that one was of General Sherman, and this sculpture was originally gilded, as it is again gilded. And it sits right across from the catchy corner from the plaza on the corner of 5th Avenue and 59th Street in New York, and it portrays this victorious general. Now we kind of have to remember that he was probably the second to Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson with his horrific repopulation of the native populations to the west of the Missouri River, as a result of which tens of thousands of Native Americans died. And so that was a mass murder. And the next one was implemented by General Sherman. He was a victorious general in the Civil War, and so in his attack on the South, Atlanta, all those cities towards the Atlantic Ocean, he just wiped out the entire, the Gone with the Wind, the wiping out of the South, and meaning the wiping out not only of populations, but also of cities and buildings. We owe it to General Sherman. Well, but here, however, he is presented invincible on this great stallion, again, moving forward. Everything moves forward. He is, and the wind meets him as he proceeds. His cloak is swept backwards, sort of like the cloaks of ancient Greek heroes on the Parthenon. And next to him walks the goddess Nike, who also is swept by the wind. She is holding in her hands sort of a palm frond as a sign of victory, and the palm frond that answers also her own wings and the tail of the horse. She also looks a bit like probably inspired by the Nike of Samothrace. So the victory's mouth is open, the horse's mouth is open, the general's face is full of resolve at doing what he must. So the whole thing just exhibits this determination for victory. At some point, here it is. It's let me see. Oh yes, so behind us is the Central Park, and this is the Plaza Hotel. This is 59th Street, and this is Fifth Avenue, right here. I'm sure it's very empty now. It was re-gilded, I don't remember, a decade ago, perhaps more. This is what it looked like before re-gilding. It almost as if the truth of the facts became more obvious when the gilding in fact fell off. The general's face is just completely implacable. There's no mercy there, and the victory looks more like one of the three Furies than the goddess of victory and even the horse, too, looks. Are there three Furies? Or the three fates? I don't know.
I think there is.
There
I think there are three Furies.
three Furies. Yeah. Well, that's what she looks like. She looks more like a Fury with her eyes dilating, her mouth open, this dribbling of the gilding, and the horse too is. It looks almost like the horse's skull. The horse looks like a pale horse of the apocalypse of Dürer's engravings. But if you look at it, look, the eyes, the nostrils. But as I said, it was regilded and as such became acceptable again. Another great project of the same sculptor lives atop the great stairs of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and as you see, even the staircase itself is extremely classical. It is embraced by soft limestone, and the Ionic order lines up the staircase as it marches towards its goal. And at the top of the staircase, very, very lovely, very beautifully sits the goddess Diana. Now, she has an interesting story. It says here Diana of or O of F, the tower, because it was a statue done by Saint-Gaudens, and it was at first a very famous New York City landmark done for Madison Square Garden. Now, Madison Square Garden at the time when it was not a sports facility, it was a social meeting place. There were restaurants there, a garden. There was a lovely building with a cupola, which since had been destroyed. And on top of it sat Weather Wing, and that was our Diana here. And the architect here of the whole thing, again, is our Stanford White, whom we had already met in the beginning. And so he wanted a weather vane, yes, very vain weather, of the Tower of Madison Square Garden. It was theater and dining complex at 26th Street and Madison Avenue in Manhattan. So he talked Saint-Gaudens, who was his friend, to make one. And at first, this is the option number 2, because the number 1 did not survive. There was a huge fire at one point and didn't survive. But it was something like 15 feet tall, and as a result didn't move very well. Even now, Gaudens gave her this beautiful scarf, which hopefully would catch the wind. But then there was a rather Puritan critic in New York at the time, because she was nude, and this man who headed the Puritanical Society, I forget the name of New York, objected sternly to it. So Gaudens tried to wrap her in some sort of sheet metal, but that flew off rather quickly. So the model for the first one was Davida Johnson Clark. She's Saint-Gaudens' model and mother of his son. So this is the first version, as I said, which did not actually survive. So the second one was commissioned, and that's the one that ended up in Philadelphia. And the second one was now, first of all, it was a foot smaller, foot and a half, and it was lighter. At this point, it did not have a scarf any longer, and it was just more graceful all around. But then, I think the first one actually may have ended up in the Columbia exhibition in Chicago, and that's where the fire happened. Then this one was installed, but then the building was demolished, and as a result of which our Diana was sent to storage, but then ultimately found a home in Philadelphia. And this Diana was modeled on someone else. She was modeled on this gorgeous girl by the name of Evelyn Nesbit. That was her first name. And Evelyn Nesbit, as a young girl, 15, 16-year-old girl, became a lover and companion of our man around town, Stanford White, who was about 30 years her senior, but who of course introduced her in all the right circles. And even after she married this millionaire, Pittsburgh millionaire, Harry Thaw, Stanford White still had, they still were connected as friends at that point. But Henry Thaw, you see, was mentally unstable and madly jealous. Even now, by the time he murdered Stanford White, which is exactly what he did in that very Madison Square Garden in the restaurant. Even though Stanford White really happened to be there accidentally, he had plans to be elsewhere, but then in the last moment changed his plans. His son was in New York, so they figured they'll go and see a show at the Garden. And that's when Henry Thaw showed up with, I gather, with Evelyn, and shot him dead. Yes. And that became the trial, it ultimately became the trial of the century. He was acquitted on the grounds of insanity. She lived a very long life and very notorious. She was an actress, a model. She was very, very beautiful, and she became also very famous as a Gibson girl. And as a Gibson girl, she was first drawn by Charles Dana Gibson.
It's a beautiful drawing.
Yeah, but if you look up Gibson girls, all the Belle Epoque, it all consists of the Gibson girls, especially that kind of hairstyle. And she was regarded, the writers at the end in the Belle Epoque described the new woman as an independent and often well-educated young woman poised to enjoy a more visible and active role in the public arena than the usual role that was attached to women in the 19th century. And everybody agreed that Charles Dana Gibson's model and his drawing really answered the universal quest. So she became the Gibson girl, and if you look up Gibson girl, you'll see Gibson girl doing sports, and Gibson girl riding horses, and Gibson girl planting flowers. Gibson girl was everywhere. And the hairdo, and presumably it was our Evelyn who became the prototype, in fact, for the Gibson girl. And as I said, we'll meet with Stanford White again, because he was a partner in architectural firm of McKim, Mead and White, who are responsible for some of the most beautiful buildings in America, including the Penn Station, which of course was destroyed as well. Next famous girl in America. So the Gibson girl was the most famous, bar none. But it did not have pretensions to high art. This one, however, did. And this one was carved by one Hiram Powers. Soon enough, he left for Europe, never returned. I think he just pretty much stayed in Rome for the rest of his life. Greece began its struggle for freedom from the Turks, because the Ottoman Empire still very much held its sway over the entire Balkan Peninsula, and that included Greece. And Greece was struggling to stay free from the Ottoman oppression, and that met with a great deal of sympathy everywhere in Europe. And in America, Lord Byron, in fact, pretended to fight for the Greek freedom. He died swimming across a river. He didn't fight much, but he certainly wrote much about it.
Byron is an ironically unbyronic figure.
Yes, Byron, it's true, a very unbyronic figure.
It's very weird. He managed to coin the phrase based on his name.
Yes, very romantic.
And then proceeded to not live up to it
Definitely.
at all.
That's right. So Hiram Powers seized his moment. You see, it's not that Americans did not paint the nudes before. This, for instance, is Ariadne asleep, and she does live in the Museum of Fine Arts. But Americans still had this Puritanism inside them that we looked at the very beginning of these lectures. And the idea of a female nude just didn't sit comfortably with them. There was too much of objectionable popism in it, objectionable Catholicism. There was something impure about it. And so Evangeline essentially again spent time abroad. But here he paints his Ariadne, who was a Minoan princess on the island of Crete, who helped Theseus, a Greek hero, to defeat the Minotaur and consequently ran away with him from the island, from her father, from her family. But Theseus, the ungrateful dog that he was, he dumped her on the island of Naxos on the way home and sailed away. And here you don't see, but there's a ship that's sailing away, leaving her all alone and forlorn on the island. But fortunately, the god of wine and merriment, Dionysus, was passing by in his heavenly chariot, drawn by leopards, and he decided he saw Ariadne, loved the look of her, and decided to cheer her up. So he landed on the island, and he proceeded to cheer her up for the rest of their lives because he married her. So that's Ariadne of Naxos. But that's
such a sweet story. I mean,
right?
It's also,
it is.
It's also just so funny that of all the gods to offer marriage,
yeah,
it's Dionysus, the god of wine and irresponsibility and revelry. I mean, you have the king of the gods shirking all his responsibilities, and meanwhile you have Dionysus, who sort of finds this girl and goes, "Look, you've clearly been treated badly in the past. Let me show you a good time, starting with this wedding ring."
Exactly.
So sweet.
Yes. So John Wonderland, obviously very much a neoclassicist, and he presents us with these female nude, and America did not approve of it, not much. However, interestingly enough, this was a very different female nude. In view of the Ottoman domination of Greece and the Greek, I mean by now the Greeks became free, and the Greek fight against this domination and fight for freedom, that was very close to American psyche. And what he does here, you see, he puts chains on her, and these chains are in marble. So they're carved spectacularly. They're chains in marble. There's a Greek flag. There's also a cross that's hanging here to indicate that the girl is Christian, and that the girl, in fact, is enslaved by the Turks and is now placed on the pedestal for sale.
But she's being sexualized by a Christian sculptor.
Right, but she became a holy nude.
Well, that's nice.
Right.
Holy nudes.
Because he even, just in case the viewers would not understand what they're looking at, he provided a pamphlet where he explained everything that I'm just explaining to you now, and how she in fact is a victim, and she is victimized by the infidel Turk. So first publicly exhibited life-size, depicting a fully nude female figure, met with unprecedented popular and critical success. Well, the fact is that the American public were actually given the opportunity to gaze at the female nude with complete justification of safety behind morality. And that's what the powers did. So, arguably the most famous American sculpture ever, the Greek slave, not only won American expatriate, because he lived elsewhere, powers international acclaim, but also enhanced the overseas reputation of American art and sculpture. After completing his first Greek slave in 1844, which lives in England, Powers produced 5 full-size versions. So this is the sort of the American nude that was acceptable to the American public, and as such became very popular. But you see, at this point, American artists, when they want to be very successful, they go elsewhere. They go to Europe to study because they feel very much, as Benjamin West had felt back in the 18th century, that which is true, that there was nowhere in America to study or to acquire this classical excellence. And these are all the sculptures that she's based on. So this is Greek slave. And at this point in Rome, and it still exists, there's a copy of Aphrodite of Cnidos, and this copy that is in Yale also is the copy of the same. And then the Medici Venus was in the Uffizi in Florence. But there are so many copies of the Aphrodite of Cnidos that anyone who wanted to take her as an inspiration could easily find copies. And then, now, so things are really hitting up, and there are all these men who are acquiring tremendous wealth, but who have nothing to show for it. I mean, they must have gorgeous villas and they must have spectacular art, but America doesn't have any of it. So they will send agents, in fact, to Europe to acquire a great deal of Italian art. And I mean, today the Philadelphia Museum of Art doesn't have much Renaissance, Italian Renaissance, but it has a spectacular collection of Northern Renaissance. And of course, the Metropolitan has a spectacular collection of Renaissance art. You're probably familiar with the name of Samuel Morse. He is the inventor of the Morse code. But before he got involved with the telegraph, he was a painter and an artist, and very much intent on creating an American artist who is not frivolous, who obviously doesn't work for kings and popes because there aren't any, but who nevertheless knows how to translate, how to graft that whole European tradition onto American optimism and American ingenuity and American honesty, integrity. So he, of course, is aware of something like this. And Johann Zofani, an 18th century painter, who painted a number of these collections, because the great European museums at the time, whether a museum, a Louvre in Paris or the Uffizi, people could just come there, and the paintings were not secure, and they could in fact sit in the chairs and have their drink and have their tea and just hang out, literally, in these great rooms, and you're pretty much looking at it. Johann Zofani, who paints, in this case, this is the great Tribuna at the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, and with all the accumulation of spectacular art. And I mean, there's Raphael, there's Titian, there is another Raphael, there is a Veronese, and of course, and here's the Medici Venus, that's right there in the Uffizi as well. A number of Hellenistic sculptures. There's a Rubens. So he actually painted this and copied these little paintings, and our Samuel Morse is very aware of it. So he does his own version, but not the glorious, over-gilded, over-attenuated 18th century version, but considerably darker and grounded American version. As you see, even though a number of these paintings indeed do have golden frames, he doesn't give them golden frames, he gives them wooden frames. And the whole tonality is much darker. He places himself, of course, in the very center. There he is, as he is instructing a young woman in the art of painting. And at that time, there was a rather large expatriate community in Rome of Americans who felt that that's where they belonged, that America just wasn't interesting enough. And then all around there are others who also Americans who are there with a purpose. They're not there to just spend some leisure time or chat with their aristocratic friends. No, they have a purpose of becoming as good as their former European counterparts, and of coming to America and serve America the best they may. And of course, the best way to do it is to learn by way of copying the great masters. So he brought this painting back, I think, New York, I think, and nobody paid attention. No one cared. I know, it was a very large painting. So nobody paid attention at all. And so he was frustrated and gave up painting and decided to dedicate himself to telegraph. And
wow, I mean, in the great scale of what happened when you failed as an artist, I suppose you have Morris at one end and Hitler at the other.
Oh my God, yeah.